Alright, this is a test video now, making a video about classical French. Just some basics, how the pieces move and what are the basic concepts. Not yet going to detailed variations, just piece placements, quite similarly as I did in the advanced French. And okay, so we have the French setup. Excuse for this arrow, the computer has made that. And classical French is when white plays knight c3 and black replies with knight f6, and then white continues with bishop to g5, so he's pinning the knight to the queen, and of course this is setting up the threat of e5, as the knight cannot move. That would be rather annoying. So black breaks the pin, e5, knight d7, bishop takes, queen takes. So this is the starting position of the classical French. Excuse me. Now, one comment is that in this position there is also the Alekhine-Chetard attack with h4, but I'll go first for the main variations with bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, as they are giving the basic idea, and after that only going to the more complicated Alekhine-Chetard attack, which is might be a gambit, but in a sense it's a very dangerous variation, at least for black, to say the least. So what is going on? This is the starting position of the classical French, and right off the bat, of course, we understand that we are left as black with the poorer bishop. So that's one thing, one key issue, and we have exchanged the dark squared bishop, so there is no dark squared bishop on f8 or on c1. So this is an exchange that has benefit white quite significantly. Alright, that is a detail. Of course, in having made this exchange, black has gained some time. So if we count how many pieces are developed, black has developed 2 pieces and white has developed only 1 piece. So I'd hold this as an advantage for black, very minor advantage. Other things, features I should say, in this position is that white has more space, that having placed his pawn on e5 especially, it's on black's territory and he has gained more space. So that's one feature of the position. As in all French positions, while white has gained more space, the central pawns might get loose during the game, and black very often attacks the center pawns with c5 and f6. So that is as in all French positions, or I should say most French positions. As black has no dark squared bishop on f8, this means that there is a significantly higher risk of having dark squared weaknesses in the position. Of course, at the moment, black does have his queen quite nicely covering the dark squares, but you might imagine that going forward in the game, if the pawn will go to c5, white might have a path coming to d6, which might be a weakness for black in that case. Now, black has to take this into consideration. However, in the main lines, most often not, it is not possible, because black will just simply stop this possibility by playing a6. And as the knight is not allowed to go to b5, there is no worry of the knight going to d6. And also in some variations where, just take this up, where white does manage to get the knight to d6, black might be able to counter with f6, and this might turn the d6 square, d6 knight I should say, weak for white, as there are then threats on e5, and maybe black will have threats like this to e5 as well. So it might be that the knight on d6 has to exchange itself to the bishop on c8, and in that case black has gotten rid of the bishop on c8. So let me get rid of these arrows now. Okay, some features there. Another thing is that black already, unlike in the advanced French, black already has developed this knight, and it's exerting pressure to e5, I should say, and it's also supporting c5. So this is a well-placed knight, and in some cases also after f6 it might return to f6. This is a very flexible knight. Quite rare are the positions where it will go to b6. So I should say that's not really very often the case. More often there might be, if white goes and takes on c5, the pawn having advanced there, the knight might recapture. There might be pressure on e5, so black might be looking forward to keep the knight on d7, and also in some cases where f6 has been played and white takes, the knight might recapture to f6. So quite a lot of options for this knight. This knight is a very flexible piece. Well, let's go through the queen is an interesting piece in this game because it has been developed early. It has a lot of responsibility over the dark squares, especially it might also be ready to support c5. It might be ready to support f6. Yes, I know it does that from d8 as well, but really this capture from e7 was not a lot of tempi, because white as well used 2 tempi to exchange the bishop. So the queen more often than not finds itself either on c5 b4, taking here, or f6, or then it just waits for a while on e7, keeps an eye on the dark squares. In some variations it will be important where white plays an early knight to b5, then actually knight b6 is important, and it's very important of course that the queen guards c7 so that there will be no fork tricks here. Okay, so those are some responsibilities for the queen, but for the first, as it has moved already once, I would keep it on e7 until it's needed somewhere else. Okay. As in several French positions, like I said, black plans to play c5. Okay. Now there's two main variations in the classical French for black, and the other is to castle early and then go c5, and the other is to avoid castling, keep the king in the center, and play a6, c5, and only after having advanced on the queen side, maybe also with the b pawn, only after those advances you will castle on the king side. The idea why to delay castling is that as the king remains in the center, it's fairly well protected by the mass of pawns, f7, e6 and d5, and actually it's much easier for white to attack, for example, h7 with such moves as bishop d3 and queen h5. So this is perhaps the wisest plan, and the plan I would recommend taking in the main lines to keep the king in the center and go a6, c5. And the point why I'm repeating this movement of pawns a6 and c5 is that development of the knight on b8, just as in the advanced French, this knight will belong to c6, where it attacks both d4 and e5, and that's fairly clear. But of course you will have to play c5 before you play the knight to c6, and as in several cases knight b5 is annoying, you will have to play first a6, then c5, and then knight c6. That's the way to go. Okay, well, what about the bishop? And I will not put a green light on this bishop. This bishop is not a great piece in the French, so it is really something that you have to look and look after and ensure that it doesn't get too weak. Now, this bishop is probably going to go to d7. That's most often the case, and as you might imagine, it's not very easy to go to d7 as there is a knight on d7 at the moment. So many times you have to wait until the knight has resolved its final destination, either on c5 or perhaps f6, and or in some cases, okay, b6 and maybe going to c4 or something like that. It will take time to develop this bishop, and it's very important not to be left with this bishop against a knight in an endgame. That will be horrible for black in most of the cases. I mean, yeah, I made this sample video where actually black was left with this bishop against that bishop in a bishop-rook endgame, but in that case black had compensation for having that bishop, as he had actually played f5 and managed to get the pawn to e4 as a pass pawn. So that was even though he had most pawns on the light squares on the same color as the bishop, he had compensation as the pawns were very dangerous in that position. So yeah, you will want to wait with this bishop to get it to d7. And also I should mention that I am not a fan of putting the bishop to b7, either with a6, b5 or with playing b6 at some point, because the bishop is not in this kind of French. Really, most of the time it's not doing that much on this diagonal. Well, there are exceptions, of course, to this rule, but I haven't found that being the case so often. Thinking about the king in classical French, castling kingside is the way to go. And often we have opposite sides castling and black attacking on the queen side and white attacking on the king side. This is one of the main features of classical French. Black having ideas of attacking the center, white trying to maintain the center with the knight and the pawn on f4, white having more space and a better bishop, and both sides attacking on the other wings. So to put it mildly, it's not let's say even Steven position. Both sides have their trumps, and I think the better player will win. It's not that black only has advantage or white only has advantage. Both players will have their own specific advantages, and that's something that makes it interesting. I should also mention, like I said before, that as this bishop is to be considered poor, this is the kind of variation. While it seems a bit slow for black, and he's playing for a draw, he really shouldn't be playing for an endgame where he is alone with that bishop, because that will be a problem. Now, the rooks, well, they will find their location. Sometimes the rook is needed on the f file, and this will be this h rook, and the a rook might be needed on the b file or the c file. Many times c file will be half open as this exchange happens on either direction, so that might be something to consider. White also has variations where he plans kingside castling. Those are interesting. They are more positional in nature. In those variations, white is aiming to cramp black down into having these two pawns against only this pawn, as this exchange has happened, and in that case this e6 pawn will be backward and somewhat weak. Maybe it needs the support of the bishop, making the bishop relatively passive. In those cases, black needs to be very active, perhaps strive for e5, getting rid of the pawn, and be ready for active play. And I should also mention that several times in those positions black has played f4 and maybe g3 to further emphasize that the whole on e5 after the pawn has exchanged on f6 is real, and the pawn on e6 is a permanent weakness. So such problems might occur for black. So he has to be careful not to be left in a bind by just let's say mechanically exchanging pieces. Well, I suppose that is a good preview of ideas in the classical French, and I should mention that in my view in classical French, white just has to play f4 to bolster up this e5 pawn. If he plays in such a way that he avoids f4, for example, with knight f3, I think he will get into trouble with the pawn on e5, that his pawn will become weak, because even though the knight has come very actively on c3 and has certain benefits of being active, White also has the problem that he can't protect d4 for the moment with a pawn from c3, and that means that after c5 it will be likely that this pawn will be exchanged off, and as this pawn disappears from d4, this pawn on e5 becomes very, very weak. That is a reason that white many times plays f4 in this variation. Now f4 is not played in the advanced French because black will be able to play after f4 knight h6, knight f5, but as the knight already is on d7, white considers that knight h6 to f5 is very unlikely, let's put it that way, as there is no knight to go there. So that in that respect, white will play f4 as he can. Okay, and white will then later continue with knight f3. Now this is the start, just talking about some ideas, and I suppose I will next move into specific variations, some examples of white going for kingside castling in this position, white going for queenside castling in this position, and the variation that I'm going for is black playing a6. I'm not a fan of the variations where black castles kingside immediately. I think those are a little bit risky. There are specific variations which get into trouble for black, and I haven't found the right antidotes for those, so I'm sticking with a6 first and delaying castling and playing castling only when it's absolutely necessary. Yes, so thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more detailed videos on this classical French variation.